Hey, everybody. Folks will trickle in as this gets going, but I think we can get started. I'm Fitz. I'm one of the founders of FreshPaint. Welcome to today's session. We're going to cover product analytics from 0.1 to 1, handling the challenges of product analytics in healthcare. Today, I have obviously myself. I'm one of the co-founders of FreshPaint. And I've got Mapolo. Mapolo, you want to give yourself a quick introduction?
Sure. My name is Mapolo. I'm a product manager at Osmind.
Excellent. Can you just tell folks what Osmind is?
Sure. Yeah. Osmind is EHR, electronic health record, and outcomes platform. We specifically focus on mental health and bringing new treatments to patients that need it the most. So those are patients that suffer from perhaps treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, addiction, and helping to bring those to market.
Excellent, thanks. Just some quick housekeeping items. We have the Q&A. It looks like some people cannot hear anything. If others can hear, please type into the chat that you can or cannot hear. I can hear you, Mapolo, just fine. We have the Q&A open. So as Mapolo is presenting and as we're talking through this, we'll be monitoring the Q&A and we'll have a session at the end for answering those questions. So I'll make sure if you type in the Q&A that your question likely does get answered unless we run out of time. And if you mix up the Q&A and the chat, Zoom is, I think, has to work on some UI, UX stuff. I'll also be monitoring the chat for questions as well, but the Q&A is where stuff will be answered. Excellent. Looks like the audio is fine for majority of people. So we can press on. So I'm one of the founders of FreshPaint. This webinar is sponsored by FreshPaint, run by us. So I'll promise I'll keep this to like 90 seconds. Just a quick plug on what is FreshPaint. We're a customer data platform. What is a CDP? It's basically a way to unify and centralize all of your customer data and connect all of the tools that consume customer data. So you want to collect data from your site, your app, your mobile app, your internal systems on who your customers are and what they're doing, what actions they're taking, what buttons they're clicking, that type of stuff. We make it really easy to collect that data and then send it to the various tools, again, that consume this data. So product analytics is what we're going to be covering today. That's probably the number one use case, number one connection. So tools like Mixpanel and Amplitude. We have customers integrate their CRM, their marketing automation platforms, their data warehouses, their advertising tools. All of these tools consume the same data, just in different formats. Instead of having to integrate 8 different tools, 8 different times with 8 different data sets, you can integrate just FreshPaint and then stream the same data out to all these various tools. This is pretty much at the code level what ends up happening. Instead of integrating Facebook, Amplitude, Google Analytics directly, you just integrate FreshPaint and then we stream or multiplex the same data out, same data set out to those tools. We have a hybrid approach to collecting data. So we combine what we call our precision tracking APIs, and this has been the standard of how you set up analytics today or in the recent past. And we also combine that with our auto track technology. So this is a way that FreshPaint automatically instruments your site or your app for you, and is a way to collect data without having to loop in your engineering team. Another key feature of FreshPaint, we also have what we call our time machine feature. So we're collecting data in the background via auto track, and we can backfill that data retroactively into your analytics tools. So if you're like, hey, I wonder how many people are clicking this button. Oh, shoot, we were not tracking that button. That's okay. In the background, FreshPaint's been collecting that data. You can label the new event in one click, backfill that data in one click, and now you're looking at, you're analyzing something that users did. in the recent past that you just set up tracking for today. I'll move on to some of our HIPAA specific functionality because I know this has some folks in the audience are from healthcare. So we have a whole feature set dedicated to managing and controlling PHI across your stack. The first thing, and I think Mapolo will talk about this briefly, is what we call ID masking. And so this is a way to integrate and send data to tools that are not HIPAA compliant, but still be compliant. And so what we do is for tools that are not HIPAA compliant, we will de-identify the user IDs. So we'll hash the user identifiers. And this meets the government's safe harbor criteria for what's called de-identifying PHI. And so this is a way to use an analytics tool, for example, without signing a BAA or without sharing PHI with that specific tool. And so you can kind of send PHI here and not send PHI to this other destination and kind of control that across your stack. Second feature I'll cover too here is what we call enforced allow lists. And so you set up destinations that are HIPAA compliant and not HIPAA compliant. And for the destinations that are not HIPAA compliant, we'll automatically block any event metadata or user metadata from going to those destinations. For what it's worth, those in healthcare, this is where we see the most HIPAA violations, is with not just the event, but the metadata in the event. So you have something like, hey, somebody booked an appointment. The fact that a user booked an appointment is not PHI on its face, but as metadata of the event, you may have a property of the event that is like the appointment date. That becomes PHI. And so what this allows you to do is filter out the PHI or the things that you know are not explicitly safe from going to a non-HIPAA compliant destination, but we'll still send the rest of the event payload. So we'll still send the booking completed event and all the other event properties that you deem as safe. And then of course, for the destinations that are HIPAA compliant, like your data warehouse, where like you own it and you control it, it's fully locked down, we'll send the event with all the PHI through automatically. So that's just a quick, 2-minute intro on FreshPaint. I will let Mapolo take over with the good stuff in today's session.
Awesome. Thank you, Fitz. Again, my name is Mapolo. I'm a product manager at Osmind. Our platform is an electronic health record, an outcomes engagement platform for mental health practices. And our goal is really to empower clinicians and research to bring innovative mental health treatments to patients who need it most. So those are the treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, addiction. And so our providers are really trying to understand data and work with these patients to help them. I'm going to talk to you today about, just bringing product data analytics to a tech startup in general. What's that like? I've done that at a few companies, including Osmind. So I'll go over how to get buy-in from stakeholders, how to kind of plan out your initial implementation, and then also kind of rolling it out to your organization. And lastly, I will touch a bit, for that first part is kind of healthcare agnostic. But I will talk about kind of some nuts and bolts about healthcare, BAAs, PHI, and how that relates to analytics specifically. So first, what I mean by 0.1. So if you're at a startup, most startups, you don't really have analytics infrastructure. And maybe if if you have kind of a product person or someone who's really into data analytics, you might be a little bit further along. But from what I've seen, and the situation when I came into Osmind was, we're basically running scripts against, our database to try to pull information about our customers. You may just have access to a production database, and you might be running, SQL queries against it to try to get information. So that's probably fine, but at some point that kind of breaks. There's a very high barrier of entry for, product managers, sales, CS to use tools like this. They have to either be able to write code, have access to the database, or know how to run SQL queries. So when I say moving from 0.1 to 1, ideally you're moving to something where anyone that at your organization that needs to ask questions about your product or your customers can go into some place, some tool like Mixpanel, Amplitude, where they can generate their own reports, queries, and do that in real time without having to go ask an engineer, without having to learn SQL. And so that's what I'm talking about from 0.1 to 1. Now, when I approach this problem or kind of this transition within healthcare and within organizations, I really focus, or I treat this like a product launch or a new feature. So I try to understand, what the users of this want, what they care about, what their needs are, and then develop a strategy in order to meet those needs and build kind of a product to meet their needs. So before you can do that, though, you often need to get buy-in from stakeholders. I've encountered different pushback from folks, founders, stakeholders, product leads that may have different opinions and thoughts on what what's important or what's not, or what the value is in a product data analytics platform. Some common themes I see is money. These things cost money, and you have to kind of justify it. Also, a lot of folks will be like, oh, well, we already have this information. We can kind of query our database and figure things out. And so I'll often hear that kind of objection to trying to roll out, something like, a product data analytics platform. So a couple of recommendations on how to handle those objections to get buy-in from your team. First, I would recommend just asking, the stakeholders within your company, your team, to ask them to compile a list of questions they have about the product. And I guarantee you're going to get a long list from different folks. Folks are going to care about different things. This is literally a screenshot from our Notion doc, where it's like, hey, these are all the things that folks asked for or had questions about in our product. Not only does this kind of highlight the need for better data and better understanding of your users, but it's also great research when it comes to implementation, which I'm going to touch upon a bit later. Another recommendation is find something that's key to your business and start asking questions about it. So for us, one thing that's really important is our providers need to get data from patients. They do that through sending out surveys, and patients need to complete those surveys in order for that to get that information. So that's very key to our business. So just if I ask questions about that, like, okay, how many patients start this survey but don't complete it? Now, I can't answer that by running a script or going to some database, and that's where the product data analytics really click in, and that event-based tracking. So I'll go ahead and ask that, and that'll really highlight maybe that need within the organization. And then lastly, start small. Many analytics platforms will give free trials, or they have freemium models. And so you can demonstrate value quickly with a quick proof of concept, or if you have a developer that has kind of experience in implementing these things, they can get up and running really quickly in even just a day. In the case of FreshPaint and auto tracking, they do have this auto tracking feature where you can literally put in a snippet. It's very little engineering work, and you can get some basic data. So I'd highly recommend just going to do that if you're still getting pushback from folks. All right, so I'm going to walk you through kind of the steps I take when rolling out or trying to plan out adding product data analytics. So first, I try to set some clear goals. Why are you doing this work? What you're trying to do? How are folks going to be using this? And then from that, I'll choose kind of this stack, and I'll share our stack. But that's really should drive your stack. or your decision on what stack to choose. Then I'll define events and properties. So I'll go into some of the details of like, choosing a taxonomy, what information to send, so that you get the most out of it. And then you implement it. And lastly, release. And I think this is often overlooked, but you have to kind of roll this out just like any other product launch or feature. You need to roll this out to your users. In this case, your users are internal to your organization. Okay, so first setting clear goals. So, maybe you've done that user research, you've gotten a bunch of data from, what the different needs are at your company. You can figure out why, specific groups care about that data. For example, sales may really care about when a customer activates or has completed onboarding, because maybe they get a commission for it. CS wants to, identify a user that might be at risk of churn or make sure that they've onboarded appropriately. And then product, as a product manager, you want to know, hey, we just released this thing, this feature, is it having the desired result or outcome that we wanted? And then from a business perspective, they might just be looking for a KPI, maybe it's monthly active users, et cetera. And so they'll care maybe about those objectives. So based on that, I try to set up like, hey, in this first iteration or implementation, I'm going to try to deliver this. I want a dashboard with some notes around reports where, our users can filter by provider or sign up date, or, sending a weekly email for reports. And so once you have that, I think that I would go ahead and do that and then start thinking about, what your tech stack is going to look like. Now, our tech stack is Osmind, or the one we've started with is Osmind to FreshPaint to Mixpanel. We decided to jump right into a CDP because that gives us flexibility in going forward. So since then, we've actually added other destinations beyond Mixpanel, but this is where we started. And the reason why we ended up landing on FreshPaint, and I think is important for you to think about when you think about your goals, is understanding, the other considerations when choosing a platform. So one thing for us is like we don't have a lot of developers, and so we want our software developers focus on building products for our end users and not focus on tracking every little button click. So auto tracking was a big thing for us because we didn't have to spend that time in development outfitting each button or interaction with events. So that was a huge component. Cost is often a component. So some products are going to be cheaper than others. You may not get as much, but that's also a component as well. Yeah, so that's set your goals, choose your stack, and then from there you start kind of getting into the details of defining your events and properties. So, an example I gave earlier, like if we really care about notes, first you want to kind of establish a taxonomy, and a taxonomy is just like how you name events. So when a user clicks on a button or performs an action in the product, how are you going to name it? And there's all different kinds of patterns out there. I think a good pattern is like the action object pattern or the verb noun pattern. So if someone in your product creates like a note or sends a message, you name it verb and then noun. So created note, sent message. I wouldn't stress over your convention. I think it's just most important that you're consistent. Some people prefer it the other way around, noun object. I don't really care. I think it's important that you just choose something and be consistent with it. That'll allow your users, your end users in Mixpanel, your team to kind of have a consistent way of finding and searching for events. The second piece is setting up user properties. So I think this is often overlooked and is really, really key. So I would actually focus a lot of attention here and making sure you get this right. So for example, if you're looking, if you want to create a chart of notes, that's very easy. And you have this data of like, okay, I can see how many notes are created each day or week or month. But then really everyone in your org is going to kind of ask different questions based on that. So they'll be like, hey, Well, I want to see how many notes were created by our new users. And so it's important to maybe have a user property for start date, or I want to break this down by account. So, you'd add like a practice user property, or specialty, or, in the case of product, I might care like what plan type they're on. So if they're on like a basic plan or a pro plan, I can see how that usage behavior may differ. And then also see how I might upsell or upsell our pro version to these basic users. Now, what that looks like in practice, like when you set up that taxonomy and those user properties, is in Mixpanel or Amplitude or whatever analytics platform you use, is you'll be able to kind of filter down and break down that information on that. So you'll see at the top, this is a simple chart where I was looking at new notes that were created within the chart. And then I can, I obscured the names, but I broke, I could break that down by provider or clinic and see how many, clinics in the last how many notes were created in the last 7 days for these particular practices. When it comes to implementation, it's, you just have to schedule it with whatever, just like you do any other, project with engineering. I will say there's a couple things that I've run into consistently in rolling out product data analytics. One is like put some thought into setting up environments. FreshPaint, Mixpanel, Amplitude, they all suggest like creating an environment for each kind of development and production environment, so that when you're testing and building this out, you're sending clean data by the time it gets to production. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time filtering out or hiding events in Mixpanel, in FreshPaint, so that your team isn't confused by it. Also, don't do it all at once. When we launched, we actually didn't do anything besides user properties and auto tracking. You can always come back and add more precision events or detailed events, as you go. So start small, try to deliver some value similar to any other kind of product or feature release, and then expand from there. Lastly, the release process, I think, is very important. So when you've rolled this out with your organization, you have to get folks on board or to use it. They've kind of indicated why they want to use it. So you should have a strategy around how to get them to actually use it. It's no different than kind of a product feature or launch. So I'll make sure, like, I invite users to Mixpanel. I'll create some dashboards, so when they first log in, they can see some data and kind of go from there. For like executive team, I'll go ahead and automate notifications. And they'll get an email every Monday morning with our KPI dashboard. I'll also hold training. So if folks have indicated they have interest in analytics or want to learn more about products or how users are using the product, I'll go ahead and schedule a training time with them, show them kind of the basics of Mixpanel or Amplitude or whatever you're using. And then kind of constantly and ongoing, just share. If a bug comes up and, there's a question about whether you should fix it or not, you can often open up, create a chart, figure out like, hey, this doesn't affect a lot of users. They're on a really old version of Firefox, like no one else is using it. We should just tell them to upgrade and not actually, try to fix this bug. It's not worth it for us. Or, when you're writing out a requirements doc, point to a chart that, shows why you're doing this work. So share. That'll kind of build that muscle memory within your organization, for creating that culture of product analytics. All right, so now I'm going to shift focus a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about PHI, kind of best practices with PHI and how that relates specifically in product data analytics. So what is PHI? Here's kind of a long list of, these are all things that are considered PHI. And so you want to be protective of this information. you don't want to reveal this unnecessarily. So I kind of have three principles that I go by. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a compliance expert. So, please consult your lawyer and HIPAA compliance expert. But I go by kind of three general principles. One, don't send it. Like if you have the choice and you don't need to send PHI, like don't include it. Number two, if you do, and it's important for you, and especially in the case of product data analytics, is like you want to understand what different users are doing, de-identify it. And this kind of covers you in the event that someone, gained access to your Amplitude account, or they had like a data breach or something. That's going to kind of cover you, because none of that information is going to be identifiable. And then last, have a good BAA in place. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but it's important that you have a BAA with folks that you're sending PHI to. Yeah. So the first one, don't send data. That's easy. Avoid it if you can. The second one, de-identification. So in the privacy rule, the HIPAA privacy rule, there is kind of this provision for like, hey, you can send data as long as it's de-identified. And there's a lot of the reason why they want that is because there's a lot of benefit to sharing data and having big data across healthcare, so it can improve like patient outcomes, drive collaboration, et cetera. But they do have kind of this section carved out for de-identification, and there's different ways you can go about doing that. One is like the expert determination method, where you do some statistical analysis and rigor and determine like, hey, if someone got this data, it would be really hard for them, or very unlikely that they would be able to like find out, which patient this data is associated with. And I think the second, and maybe the more practical one, is especially for startups, is the safe harbor method, where it's like, hey, we have this long list of data that is considered PHI, and just like, don't include that in your de-identified data. So what that looks like kind of in the analytics space, if you look at that list of these PHI events, is there's a number of them that are often tracked automatically. So if you install a mixed panel snippet or Amplitude snippet or FreshPaint snippet, I think actually in FreshPaint these aren't necessarily tracked. Some of them aren't tracked automatically, but these are typically tracked. So like if you if a user logs in on their mobile device, it'll track their device ID. It'll say maybe where they're coming from, their IP address, etc. And so that kind of comes automatically with those products and with these analytics services. So this is PHI. You don't necessarily want to track it automatically, and so. If you can kind of avoid that or de-identify these users, go for it. So this was a big thing for us with FreshPaint, because FreshPaint we had a good BAA in place with FreshPaint, and then we can kind of prevent this data, this other PHI, from getting to other destinations where we might want to use it. Yeah, so just a little like anecdote, we were talking to different vendors and, platforms when trying to decide on our stack. And this was literally a quote from an email that I got. It basically saying like, hey, we're like sort of HIPAA compliant, like just don't send us PHI and we're HIPAA compliant, which in my mind is kind of like, well, why are we even signing a BAA? Like everything's kind of de-identified. But there are like major implications of, part of the reason why you use these analytics platform is you get a bunch of stuff out of the box. And if you're having to obscure all this stuff, or do an HTTP, or like a backend implementation where you're not using the auto tracking, or you're not getting kind of the properties out of the box, you're creating a lot more engineering work. And you're not necessarily getting the analytics you need. So that was just kind of an anecdote. Not all BAAs are created equal, so read them, read the fine print, and yeah, and just be conscious of that, because they'll basically say sometimes like, hey, we signed this BAA, but when you read the fine print, it's like, well, actually, don't send us this data. And so, you want to cover yourself and keep that health information private when you're implementing and deciding on your stack. So that's all I have. Happy to open it up to any questions.
I love the plug on hiring. I didn't expect
Got to
this.
get that in. Always got to get that in.
Yeah, no, I can, from experience, it's really hard to hire good folks. So yeah. Some questions that came through live in the Q&A. Could you go back and repeat the list of your 3 recommendations for getting buy-in from stakeholders and stuff? And then also there was a question when somebody registered, basically same thing, like what are the best tactics you've seen to work when you do get pushback from like your founder or some other exec that actually controls the money for getting buy-in on this stuff?
Yeah, good questions. So quickly to run through kind of the 3 suggestions is I would kind of put it on the team. You want to highlight like that pain point. So one was I just literally created a Notion doc, asked our sales team, CS team, business team, founders to, hey, just like what questions do you have about the product that you don't know about, or user behavior, and they generated that list. And this kind of, it gets people like thinking about like, oh, I don't know this, I should know this, we should know this, and so that kind of helps get buy-in from them. The second one was like, if you think about like, if you just have like information in your database, so you've really kind of captured like the end result. So if someone filled out a survey, I have a record that they filled out the survey, but I don't really have a record of the path of how they got there. And so maybe I could double that number if I cut out a step or made it easier. And so you can kind of ask those questions. And these are kind of problems that, or questions that, a BI tool, or you can't get from a SQL query. So like, I can't tell unless I have like some really complete logging, like how many people click this start button and how many people answered that first question. I can't like get that just from a database. And so an analytics platform will allow you to kind of measure maybe what that drop off is over time. And then you can relook at your design, et cetera. The last one is you can kind of like just build like a proof of concept or something that shows that value. So if you can kind of steal like an engineer for an afternoon or a day, you can kind of put something together, show them the value of it, and kind of get additional buy-in. Regarding money specifically, I get really frustrated by that, like by that kind of excuse for product data analytics. Engineers cost a lot of money, especially in the Bay Area where I'm from and where I work is, and I think, now with COVID, remotely, engineers command a healthy salary, and you're paying them a lot of money. And so if you make a bad decision and spend 2 weeks of an engineer's time going down some rabbit hole that is not important because you don't have good data, you've wasted a ton of money and a ton of time for your team. And so I would kind of push back on that. You could highlight a time where maybe you made a bad decision because you didn't have good data. Or you can, highlight those opportunities that if you had good data, you think you could improve things. Okay. I think I answered that question.
Yeah, great. Let's see some other questions. Here's a quick one. How have you liked Mixpanel? And I think because you came in and you started like, hey, this stuff is in our database, just query it with SQL. And so, and I think you've used a couple of other product analytics vendors in the past as well.
Yeah, so I had kind of actually before Mixpanel, I used a lot of Amplitude in the past. From my perspective, they're kind of similar. They provide the similar amount of value. They both have like good charting techniques, cohorting techniques, funnel techniques, like tracking users through different flows. And for us, Mixpanel was a little bit just more startup friendly. Their pricing model kind of could grow with us. I think Amplitude had like a higher entry point, so we had to sign up for an annual contract. It was a lot more expensive. Even though we don't have like we're kind of growing and we don't have like a huge amount of users yet. And so Mixpanel was friendly and in terms of pricing. And in terms of functionality, it's been fine. It's been great. Haven't really had any issues.
Cool. How do you decide when to use precision tracked events versus auto track events? And I think you maybe covered this a little bit, but this was a question from somebody a few minutes ago live.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question, and I think it really depends on kind of what's important. When you do a precision event, there is some sort of development time, so you have to basically specify, using your taxonomy is like, hey, I want to track this event in this way, and I want these properties associated with that event. So, especially for the key pieces or key actions for your business, spend time there and do that. For other actions, we're like, hey, I just want to do a button click or track how many people use this or how different people are navigating. I would use like kind of the auto tracking. I wouldn't spend a bunch of time figuring that out. I think one kind of use case where I'd recommend precision events is like, I'm going to go back to this example of we send out a survey from the provider. So the provider sends out that survey, using our provider portal. And so in that instance, we'd want to identify that, we sent out this survey, it has some identifier. Then on the back end, we'd want to have a precision event that tracks that we sent out that notification to the patient. And then on the patient's app, have an event that says that they opened or interacted with this survey. And so you do a precision event so you could track all the way through that funnel. Because if you only look at it as pieces, you don't necessarily have that kind of complete picture. So that would be an example of where I would recommend doing a precision event. And that's also an instance where that particular action or flow is very important for our business.
Yeah, and I liked what you said earlier during your presentation, where it was like, start small. You don't have to like tag everything up right away. You can always go back and access data really quickly. If you're like, hey, I wonder how many users interact with this thing. Sometimes your curiosity doesn't necessarily map to like, I'm going to grab an engineer's time to spend time on this. And so you can just do that yourself. And then if you actually see like, hey, this thing like might actually be important for us to start tracking in a slightly more robust way, then you can, code up a server-side event or precision tracking or something. Let's see. Curious if we could go a layer deeper on your stack. What are you using within the Osmind stack that you're connecting to FreshPaint?
I guess I don't. Yeah, so we have our I guess our infrastructure is React. Like we have a React web app and a React Native mobile app. So we use the JavaScript snippet for a web app, and then on our mobile side we use the FreshPaint SDK. Is that what is meant by that question, or? Yeah.
I think maybe we can wait for if not, we can wait for a chat to come through.
Yeah. So anyway, that we use basically at our different apps, we send that data to FreshPaint. We also have some kind of backend events, especially for identifying users, where when a user logs in, we check or grab the latest information about them and push an identify call to FreshPaint, and that kind of updates all the user properties going forward. So those are kind of the different things we use on the Osmind side to send stuff from FreshPaint. And then from FreshPaint, we have, we point to Mixpanel, and we also recently have, introduced intercom to that as well. So we can send user properties and event properties to intercom.
A follow-up from Maggie here was she has to pick a new database and she's starting from scratch. So she's curious what database you're using.
Yeah, I think I would go Postgres. Yeah, it's I think it's just super common. Again, I'm not an engineer, but I would go with Postgres. I think we're dealing with a little bit of a, we made a different choice early on. And as a result, we're kind of migrating things to Postgres. I think at a certain scale, and depending on the amount of data you have, Postgres kind of, breaks down a little bit, but especially early on, I think it's super common. There's lots of tools around it, so that's what I would recommend. I don't know, Fitz, maybe you have a different take.
Well, this is not widely known, but FreshPaint actually started as a Postgres performance analytics company. And so our position is you could scale Postgres a lot more than you think. Terrible business. We ended up pivoting years ago to FreshPaint's current form. It's much better. But yeah, just a follow-up question on the precision versus auto tracking stuff. So Matt wants to know, is this a good way to think about it? Precision tracking is like my core funnel steps, and then auto track is like everything else kind of fills in the gaps. Or what do you have anything?
Yeah, I think that's like a pretty good kind of rule of thumb, especially early on. I was listening to the webinar last week with Modern Health, and they're at like a very different scale. They have entire teams, and so for them, maybe the precision is kind of everywhere. But I think especially early on, I think this is like a great rule of thumb.
Great. How do you think about taxonomy governance and ensuring that event and property definitions are well understood and not misinterpreted? And then there's also, I think, a related question, let's see, that came in through the chat. Can you speak a little bit about setting up internal documentation at your company that teaches other PMs and developers how they should and implement tracking after you've already gone through the work of like a FreshPaint implementation? In other words, like when a PM wants to track an event, what documentation do you have in place for like a new developer to know how to implement that request?
Yeah, this is a good question, and definitely like it's easy when if you're like the only one that's kind of setting like what the events are, to kind of ignore this step, because you can just be like, I'm following this, and it lives up in your head. But especially as your organization scales and you bring on new PMs or new folks that are trying to implement events, it's important to establish that taxonomy. So there's a lot of great resources out there. I know like Amplitude has a bunch, Mixpanel, whoever. There's a lot of great resources on like choosing a taxonomy. So I wouldn't try to reinvent the wheel there. You can literally like find some of those resources, copy and paste it, maybe adapt it within your organization, have it like on an internal Notion or wiki page or whatever. And kind of establish that as like, hey, this is how we name events at your company. And one thing I'd recommend is like be selective about what events you track. Like at some point, like page views are not important. You're trying to think about the user actions and the things that they're trying to do within your application. The other thing I highly recommend is, because definitely if you name an event like, hey, created note, in healthcare, that means one thing. For someone else, maybe as your product expands, there might be 4 different ways of creating a note within your system. So on your end kind of product analytics side, most of those platforms have a way to set descriptions. So mixed panel amplitude, you can kind of describe what the event is in a little bit more detail. It's definitely a little bit more work and tedious to do that, but that really makes it better for your end users in understanding what a specific event is. So when they hover over that event within Mixpanel, they can see that kind of description of what it is in more detail. So when they do have that question, or they're less likely to misinterpret it because you've provided that extra information.
I think you actually nailed another answer or another question that I was going to follow up with from Nikhil. Do you have any recommendations on how to name events and maintain a database of names so that it doesn't get too confusing for newcomers? So I think you just wrapped that up as well.
Yeah, and some of the product analytics, products build products around this. I think FreshPaint also has some stuff where you can kind of rename events before they leave FreshPaint so that they end up a little nicer at your destination. So you can, especially if you have a bigger team, you could have someone kind of be in charge of that or manage that. But also on the mixed panel amplitude side, you can change the name of the event later on if you've messed something up or you want to rename it. You can just change it so it appears differently within the UI.
There's a question that was asked by somebody when they registered. At what point should we opt for a customer data platform as opposed to just integrating Mixpanel directly? I'm hearing conflicting messages from different departments. What is the tipping point for adding a CDP versus just integrating directly in terms of destinations? And I think you have a pretty interesting view on this because in the beginning, you did just have one destination. It was just Mixpanel, but you still decided to go with us and basically a middle layer. So maybe talk through how you think about that.
Yeah. So I've experienced kind of doing both. So at a couple companies, just went direct to Amplitude, for example. And then at my previous role, we went through Segment to Amplitude, and we just had that single destination for a while. But at some point when you start growing, and I think it's about the time when you start thinking about hey, we need a product data analytics platform, it's you're also going to want to start sending events to other places. So I knew in the back of my mind, we're gonna want to send stuff for our support tools so that we can send events to Intercom and trigger product tours or campaigns around events. And so I had that kind of in the back of my mind. So it might, yeah, I would say you don't, there's a huge benefit to doing it. The other thing is if you decide that Mixpanel is not good for you, you can just switch to Amplitude, and that decision is quick and easy if you have, FreshPaint or some other CDP in that middle layer. So I kind of thought about it more from this gives us flexibility going forward, and maybe I'm not making the right decision right now, but it gives me flexibility later to kind of change that. And I knew that we were going to eventually need to send it to those places. I think it's always harder. Engineering resources, I think, are the scarcest things. And every time you want to implement a new tool, it's a pain to have to go and prioritize that work over other work. So in my mind, I had kind of seen the benefits of using it before. And so it was kind of a no-brainer for me. So I don't think there's a number of destinations where you should make the decision. I think it's it could be one destination you can make that decision.
That's a good segue into another question that was asked ahead of time. What would you suggest for a recommended stack for companies that are a similar stage to Osmind that are basically just starting out with this stuff? And then maybe you've seen this in the past or you're expecting to see it at Osmind. Part two is how do you see that stack evolving over the course of the company's life cycle?
Yeah, I think our stack is pretty good on the analytics front. you have your product or products, and then you send events to I like having a CDP there. It gives us a lot of flexibility. And especially in healthcare, like the benefit of kind of the filtering or not sending events to places is really valuable. It gives you more flexibility in how many tools you can use or like what your stack looks like. So I'd recommend the CDP, and then I would start with product analytics. I think that's like the natural place to start. I tend to find that the product, your product and business are the ones that are kind of most interested in those statistics, and those products best serve those users. So that's where I would start. So Amplitude or Mixpanel. Yeah, I had mentioned earlier, I think, for us, Mixpanel, the pricing made a lot more sense. You can kind of, they basically scale on the number of users you have. So, yeah, you kind of were kind of paying for what you get. With Amplitude. If like, at least in our negotiations, it was more like we have to hit this minimum, which turned out to be a lot of, dollars per user. And then I think to the second part of that, like, where do I see us going in the future? I can see us adding additional destinations. So we've already added Intercom to that. I think at some point we'll probably have some sort of database for maybe like another product offering where you can run big data queries against patients within our system, and some sort of reporting. So maybe we do like some data conversion, put it in a Snowflake database or something like that. And so I could kind of see that further down the road. I think the Modern Health webinar is the one, if you want to kind of think maybe more broad term. They'd probably have better insight into like what that looks like at a big org.
Yeah, for those of you not familiar with what Mapolo is referring to, we did a webinar last week with the data team at Modern Health, and is basically what their data stack looks like. The recording will be available shortly on our site. So if you're interested, shoot me an email, send me a message. I can make sure you guys get the recording if you were not able to attend or didn't know that it was happening last week. I think this is more a question for me from Nikhil. We found some discrepancies in data if we collected through something like a fresh paint and pushed to a destination versus directly collecting it using something like Amplitude. Is it common, or are we missing something? If this is an issue with us, reach out to our team and we can we can get you squared away. This is not common. I don't think we would have a very good business for ourselves if this was common. And the reason that it's not common is most integrations that Fresh Paint works, and our competitors work the same way, is like with Mixpanel, for example. When you integrate Mixpanel with Fresh Paint, we will actually load Mixpanel's SDK as well. It's called a client-side integration. And so we don't stand in the way of any data that Mixpanel would collect directly out of the box. This is like a good example here is like Google Analytics collects like time on site and like a bunch of other metrics that frankly are not useful for product managers, product teams in my opinion. It's more useful for marketing teams and marketers. Fresh Paint does not collect something like time on site out of the box. And so we don't want to like limit Google Analytics's functionality. So we'll just load Google Analytics as well on your site and then tell Google Analytics like what to track, any specific events that you have set up in Fresh Paint. So that's how the majority of integrations work. You can integrate stuff server side where Fresh Paint is the filter and only what Fresh Paint collects is being sent to the destination, but that is less common. And so, yeah, if this has been an issue with us, reach out to our team. Our team is very responsive. We will hook you up with an engineer and we can get you sorted out. Mapolo, you've actually done both a direct implementation of a product analytics tool and then through Fresh Paint. And I also think you've used one of our competitors as well in a previous life. So maybe you can, if you have anything else to add here, or like a gotcha that is maybe a simple step that happens up front that somebody is missing. If not, we can move on.
Yeah, I definitely, sometimes you kind of run into issues like going end to end, or you expect stuff to be there a little bit differently. I think in the case of fresh paint, with the HIPAA allow list, there's definitely like, you need to like, you're actually setting what goes to mixed panel. And so there will be discrepancies between like when you actually, if you just put the Amplitude SDK in there, they're going to send everything. If you have fresh paint in there, you're gonna kind of pick and choose what actually gets to your destination. So there is a little bit of nuance there. And then also kind of on the, especially on the user property front, and that's why I said, spend some time there and think about that, is there's kind of a order of operations where you send user properties, and that can kind of result in maybe a difference in expectation. So we definitely ran into that a little bit. We were able to resolve those issues by reaching out to support, and it was more kind of just like an implementation error on our end.
Cool. We actually covered all of the questions, and we are right at time. So thanks everybody for joining. The recording will be available shortly, so I'll make sure that everybody gets the email for the recording if you want, and the slides as well. Thanks so much to you, Mapolo, for doing this. This was a lot of fun. Very engaged audience this time, so it's like super fun. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Take care.